This video is part of the chapter competition in the course Evolution of Plant Interactions at the Ostrava University. In biology, a resource is broadly defined as anything that increases individual fitness when being used at increasing rates. For plants, this can be water, sunlight, nutrients in the soil, and even pollinators that enhance seed production. If we assume that resource consumption is proportional to its abundance, as is the case when there is no competition, the plant performance will increase as resource availability increases. The increase could be linear or exponential. This is yet another painstaking curve to obtain, as multiple plants need to be grown in environments with different resource levels in order to obtain such a curve. But you are probably already aware that infinite growth is not something that commonly occurs in plants. More often, plant performance will increase with resource consumption up to a certain level, beyond which no matter how much resource is supplemented in the environment, it will not affect plant or population growth because it is physiologically not possible to use more of the resource. For example, photosynthetic activity of the plants is limited by their ability to uptake CO2 from the environment through their stomata. Because the number of stomata per leaf is limited, the photosynthetic activity will increase as CO2 concentration increases up to a certain point. Beyond this point, even if more CO2 is present, it will not affect the photosynthetic activity of the plant. In some cases, exceeding a certain amount of resources in the environment can have toxic consequences on plant development. In Dactylis glomerata, for instance, adding nitrogen in the environment increases its growth rate up to a certain point, beyond which adding more nitrogen in the soil has a negative effect on plant growth. So contrary to the definition, at extreme concentrations, the uptake of this resource has negative effect on plant performance. This is analogous to taking medicine when you are sick. At prescribed doses, the medicine has good effect on your health, but at too high doses, it might make you even more sick than you initially were. In most natural ecosystems, resource availability varies in time and space. According to the spatial variation, resources can be divided into several categories. Continuous resources. These rarely occur in the nature, but we can argue that O2 and CO2 concentration can be considered as resources with continuous distribution. After all, wherever the plants grow, there is air, right? Variability as gradient. These resources increase their abundance gradually in space. Typical example for this are resources in alpine environments or along coastal lines. An example is the variation of the water gradient in coastal wetlands. The further you get from the coast, the lower the water concentration is in the soil. Patchy resources are unevenly distributed in space. Depending on the size of the patches, we can talk about finely grained or coarsely grained patches of resources. An example of this is the light patches available for the plants growing under tree canopies. Finally, isolated resources, as their name says, occur only sporadically in a given environment. A typical example of this are desert oases. Another example of isolated resources are serpentine soils. These soils are rich in heavy, toxic metals and only comprise about 1 to 2% of the terrestrial soils. You can legitimately ask, can toxic metals be considered as resources? Indeed, there are some plants that have adapted to either tolerate or even require heavy metals for their growth, such as Minuartius meikali on the left and Laspis erulescens on the right. Spatial and temporal scales are, of course, only meaningful when measured relative to the scale of the organism concerned. You can intuitively guess that annual change of seasons does not affect annual and perennial plants in the same way. According to their temporal variation, we can also classify resources as stable high or stable low. This means their abundance doesn't vary much in time. In grasslands, a stable high resource would be sunlight, because no plant outshadows the others, whereas space for growth is a stably low resource because the grassland is already densely colonized. Some resources vary in time in a predictable manner, and these are called periodical resources. Such is the case of resources linked to season, which periodically repeat every year. Other resources vary in an unpredictable manner. This plot shows the availability of soil water over the summer season in a spruce forest. Dark patches correspond to high water availability. You can see how water availability changes in an unpredictable way from one month to the other, because the distribution of dark and light patches over time does not follow any particular pattern. Finally, Paul's resources are intensely abundant for a short time and rare or absent the rest of the time. This is the case of pollinators, which can only function at certain temperatures.